And now Howard Brown from Binghamton University.
Thank you, William. We were going to have another panelist that hasn't been mentioned yet, Daryl Hafner, who has done a fair amount of work on labor, and she was going to connect her work to that of Michael's first project, which was actually on early 19th century artisans, and that was his dissertation work, and it produced some articles along the way, but they'll be left aside today, unfortunately. In that work, he got to know the police archives, and he became an expert, especially in the archives of the Napoleonic police, and had already been working on the Napoleonic police for many years before I turned my scholarly attention in the mid-1990s to, quote, Violence, Justice, and Repression from the Terror to Napoleon, which is the subtitle of my book that appeared in 2006, Ending the French Revolution. Soon we had a myriad of overlapping experiences with different archival series, most notably F7, the vast treasure trove of state police records in the Archives Nationales. However, we did not always share the same approach to the material. This is a theme. Yeah. Excuse me. Notably when it came to larger conceptualization. I first developed some of the basic framework for my book in an article published in the Journal of Modern History in 1997. There I suggested that the trajectory from the Directory to the Empire involved the defeat of representative democracy by liberal authoritarianism and the creation of a security state. To my gratification, both concepts have gained a certain credence among scholars of the period, but Michael, on the other hand, was not inclined to accept this terminology. Apparently it smacked of conceptual, or worse, theoretical approaches to history. And he was akin to Richard Cobb in not liking conceptual approaches and following Cobb's famously complaint about the Huns of sociology invading the discipline of history. Right? In response, Michael preferred the traditional terminology of Napoleonic police state. Our disagreement about terminology was always cordial, both in print and in person. Never a straw man raised. In fact, these were years when, in order to reduce expenses, we repeatedly shared rooms at French history conferences, including the Western, on several occasions. I granted that his preferred term, police state, had its merits, and he did the same for my preferred term, security state. Nonetheless, it is worth exploring the differences between them, because they are essentially distillations of larger interpretations regarding the nature of Napoleonic rule. I will not, however, use Michael's unfortunate passing earlier this year as an opportunity to have the last word in our genial disagreement. Rather, I would like to suggest that as much as he objected to conceptual or theoretical constructs as the basis for interpreting historical evidence, describing the Napoleonic regime as a police state introduced conceptual baggage of its own. Moreover, it was baggage that Michael clearly wanted to keep. In order not to claim the last word, I will lay out my formulation first, then turn to several works in which Michael provided the evidence that underpinned his preferred terminology. I noted in my Ending the French Revolution, citing Michael's earlier work, that Napoleonic France is often called a police state, and with some justification. Though the effectiveness of the Minister of Police and his networks of agents has often been exaggerated, they did provide an important prophylaxis against political opposition. The Haute Police, as the political police were called, helped to prepare two lengthy prescription lists of prominent Jacobins in November 1799 and January 1801. They arbitrarily imprisoned and even deported the unconvicted detritus of brigand bands. And they locked up hundreds of political opponents in special state prisons without trial. The Napoleonic regimes also perfected a system of administrative surveillance akin to internal exile. Whereas the Directory had used preventive detentions in areas of civil strife, the Napoleonic system of putting suspects under official surveillance spread across France. This was a purely administrative measure with no basis in law, which forced several thousand men and women to live away from their preferred residences and to report regularly to local officials. These arbitrary and often illegal practices were so acceptable to Napoleonic lawmakers that the Senatorial Commission on Personal Liberties, which considered more than 550 cases of dubious detention between 1804 and 1814, never openly opposed police decisions and only rarely even questioned them. Many historians consider these measures evidence that Napoleon turned France into a police state. This is drawn from my conclusion. Whereas describing Napoleonic France as a police state has some justification, it is better termed a security state, I argued. The semantic change does not reflect a difference of moral judgment, but more fully captures the nature of the new regime. Security state emphasizes the importance of surveillance and regulatory control to maintain public order, rather than simply using coercive force to restore it. The term security state has the additional advantage of reflecting the social justification, and therefore the main political legitimacy, for the new tutelary administrative and judicial apparatus that supplanted the democratic institutions of the Revolution. The consulate not only eliminated representative democracy and fortified criminal justice in the name of social order, it helped to construct a security state by undertaking a vast administrative regulation of society. Thus, increasingly fine-grained administrative oversight enmeshed local communities, at first through repression and then through supervision. The empire went on to devise a harsher penal code, streamline criminal procedures, and revise the system of courts. But these only confirmed the authoritarian character of Napoleonic rule. They did not change the fundamental nature of the security state. While delivering the security that many had good reason to want, the consulate produced a state that few would have chosen. And you can hear in that an echo of my writing in the post-9/11 world, in which a lot of people were becoming increasingly comfortable with enhanced security that would formerly have been unacceptable. So my formulation of the concept of security state derived from Michel Foucault's lectures on governmentality, a neologism Foucault used to capture the continuities between the Polizeistaat, or well-ordered police state of enlightened absolutism, and the liberal democratic polities of Western Europe in the 19th century. In part, quoting Foucault, governmentality is a complex form of power, which has as its target population, as its principal form of knowledge, political economy, and as its essential technical means, apparatuses of security. Michael did not entirely object to Michel, but preferred plain speaking instead. Michael laid out his preferred terminology in a chapter unambiguously titled The Napoleonic Police State, published in Philip Dwyer, Napoleon in Europe, 2001. The chapter began, Napoleon's France was a police state. It cannot compare for ruthlessness and horror with the 20th century police states like those of Hitler, Stalin, and Pinochet. No jackbooted police, concentration camps, or disappearing political opponents. He went on to note that my terms liberal authoritarianism and security state were intended, as I had written, to avoid the exaggerated connotations of police state. Finally, Michael summarized his position by saying, despite Brown's well-founded reservations, however, police state is too much a part of our daily language to discard quite so readily. Michael based his case on the power and influence that the Minister of General Police exercised in the day-to-day workings of the Napoleonic government. He also succinctly asserted that the true measure of a police state is its surveillance of its citizens and the way in which it manages a peaceful political dissent. Even more significant to his terminology, however, was the failure of the Napoleonic regime to provide adequate safeguards against violations of civil rights advanced by the French Revolution. He made this case in another important book chapter, Arbitrary Detention, Human Rights, and the Napoleonic Senate, in a volume edited by myself and Judith Miller entitled Taking Liberties, Problems of a New Order from the Terror to Napoleon, which appeared in 2002. Here he meticulously examined the records of the Senatorial Commission on Human Rights that existed from 1804 to 1814 as a supposed bulwark against arbitrary imprisonment. He determined that the Commission handled 551 distinct cases, that a quarter of them were overtly political, and that 16 were actually prisoners detained at the request of their own families. Careful attention to that kind of detail really characterized Michael. He came to the conclusion that at no time did the Minister of General Police ever liberate a prisoner at the express request of the Senatorial Commission. Indeed, the senators never explicitly asked for any such thing. Rather, the Commission prompted bureaucratic inquiries that sometimes led to release, but usually led to justifications from the minister in defense of continued incarceration without trial, and no test of strength ensued. Only once did the Commission refer its concerns to the Emperor himself. In short, quote, whatever the senators might think of police procedures, they, like the rest of the ruling elite, looked to the police as an indispensable rampart against the perpetual threat of political and social chaos. They accepted the regime's authoritarianism because they sincerely believed that, in the aftermath of the French Revolution, meaningful liberty could flourish only under a state strong enough to enforce its authority and fully determined to do so. What's interesting about this paper and its arguments is that it was circulated to Isser Woloch in advance because he was going to comment on it at the symposium where it was presented first. And Isser Woloch called me up to say, I need to clear the air here. I've got a chapter coming out on the military, or on the senatorial commission in my forthcoming book, and I don't want to slight Michael in this least, but I have a completely different argument. And I just want everyone to know, including you who organized the conference, that I had this before I ever read his piece. Okay, so it was a kind of an interesting moment. But it appeared in a book with the rather loaded title, Napoleon's Collaborators. Okay, and this is where Isser Woloch argued that Jacobins and democratic liberals from the French Revolution had been co-opted by Napoleon, became his collaborators, and yet managed, by being on the team, so to speak, to curtail some of his authoritarian tendencies. So you can see the opposite argument being made by Isser Woloch than had been made by Michael Sibalis in terms of the Senatorial Commission on Human Rights. Michael concluded, when all is said and done, Napoleonic France was a police state. The Minister of General Police kept the nation under surveillance with a network of secret agents, sought to control all public expressions of opinion, and detained alleged troublemakers of every sort, from political opponents to ordinary criminals, by administrative order without formal charge or trial. After my book Ending the French Revolution appeared in 2006, Michael published Political Prisoners and State Prisons in Napoleonic France in a volume, Napoleon and His Empire, edited by Philip Dwyer and Alan Forrest in 2007. I especially appreciate the opening, which combines several of Michael's strengths as a scholar: his sense of irony, his sensitivity to the plight of the downtrodden, devotion to historical accuracy, and his clarity of expression. He always wrote extremely well. The chapter strikingly opens, "The most famous of Napoleon's political prisoners never existed." This was, of course, Edmond Dantes, the Count of Monte Cristo. Alexandre Dumas' fictional character was based in part on a supposed Napoleonic prisoner, a Parisian shoemaker named François Picot, who was mistakenly imprisoned for 7 years during the Empire as a would-be agent of the English named Louchet. With his characteristic assiduity in seeking to set the facts straight, Michael determined that the basis for Dumas' character was fictive as well. No police file existed for either Picot or Louchet, and they do not appear on the list of prisoners where he was supposedly incarcerated. As Michael explained, however, the force of the anecdote lay not in its historical accuracy, but rather, quote, in its dark vision of Napoleon's police and his political prisons. The police were overly suspicious, arbitrary, and quick to act on rumor and denunciation. Their victims disappeared to suffer for years in some distant fortress. In the same way that the lettres de cachet and the Bastille symbolized royal despotism in the Austrian regime, Napoleon's prisons have always been integral to the black legend of the emperor and his police state. Michael calculated that Napoleon's police detained 200 to 300 true political prisoners at any one time, about half of whom were held in the 7 official state prisons scattered around the empire. If some were spies or dangerous conspirators, most were of no more than minor irritants to the regime, and their detention for an indeterminate period was out of all proportion to any offense, real or imagined, he wrote. The moral condemnation inherent in this passage is the reason Michael held so steadfastly to the term police state. As far as he was concerned, it had 3 essential features. It was a term already in common usage, devoid of theoretical underpinnings and that sort of thing. That's critical too, second point. It contained also, and perhaps most importantly, a moral condemnation of Napoleon's authoritarianism and failure to uphold the civil rights proclaimed by the French Revolution. Police state first appeared in English in the mid-19th century in condemnation of Metternich's methods of preserving order in Austria and beyond. It was this original meaning and its attendant moral connotation, its baggage, as I put it earlier, that Michael most wished to preserve. Thank you.